Welcome to Top 10 Lists. These are 3 fairy tales with different Disney versions from the original tales. Please like or comment for part 2. There are a lot of beautiful fairy tales out there, but some of them have dark origin stories. These stories were sanitized by Disney for the modern audience, so we see happy endings. These are the origin stories for some of these fairy tales. The first story is the Pied Piper of Hamelin. When, lo, as they reached the mountainside, a wondrous portal opened wide, as if a cavern was suddenly hollowed. And the piper advanced and the children followed. And when all were in to the very last, the door in the mountainside shut fast. Robert Browning, The Pied Piper of Hamelin, A Child's Story. Many are familiar with the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Few realize, however, that the story is based on real events, which evolved over the years into a fairy tale made to scare children. The Pied Piper of Hamelin story. For those unfamiliar with the tale, the Pied Piper of Hamelin is set in 1284 in the town of Hamelin, Lower Saxony, Germany. This town was facing a rat infestation, and a piper, dressed in a coat of many-colored, bright cloth, appeared. This piper promised to get rid of the rats in return for a payment, to which the townspeople agreed. Although the piper got rid of the rats by leading them away with his music, the people of Hamelin reneged on their promise. The furious piper left, vowing revenge. On July 26 of that same year, the piper returned and led the children away, never to be seen again, just as he did the rats. Nevertheless, 1 or 3 children were left behind, depending on which version is being told. One of these children was lame, and could not keep up, another was deaf and could not hear the music, while the third one was blind and could not see where the other children were going. But what really happened? There are manuscripts that say, "It's been 100 years since our children left." The supposed street where the children were last seen is today called Bungelosenstrasse, Street Without Drums, as no one is allowed to play music or dance there. Incidentally, it is said that the rats were absent from earlier accounts, and only added to the story around the middle of the 16th century. Moreover, the stained glass window and other primary written sources do not speak of the plague of rats. But what really happened? There have been numerous theories trying to explain what happened to the children of Hamelin. For instance, one theory suggests that the children died of some natural causes, and that the Pied Piper was actually a personification of death. By associating the rats with the Black Death, it has been suggested that the children were victims of that plague. Yet, the Black Death was most severe in Europe between 1348 and 1350, more than half a century after the event in Hamelin. Another theory suggests that the children were actually sent away by their parents, due to the extreme poverty in which they were living. Yet another theory speculates that the children were participants of a doomed children's crusade, and might have ended up in modern-day Romania. There is also the suggestion that the departure of Hamelin's children is tied to the Ostsiedlung, in which a number of Germans left their homes to colonize Eastern Europe. Reflecting on this hypothesis, Wib Reimer, project coordinator at the Hamel Museum, says, "In this scenario, the Pied Piper played the role of a so-called locator or recruiter. They were responsible for organizing migrations to the east and were said to have worn colorful garments, and played an instrument to attract the attention of possible settlers." Yet another suggestion is that this is an account of dance mania, also known as St. Vitus dance. This affliction gripped mainland Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries, and has been described as individuals dancing hysterically through the streets for hours, days, and apparently even months, until they collapsed due to exhaustion or died from heart attack or stroke. Another of the darker theories even proposes that the so-called Pied Piper was actioned into the town of Hamelin, to abduct children during their sleep. Perhaps the horrible nature of the children's disappearance is the reason why there are few details on what happened. Reimer ponders, did something happen that officials had been covering up? Something so traumatic that it was transmitted orally for so long in the town's collective memory, over decades, and even centuries? Whatever happened to the children, it seems to be a lot different to the story that was told in the storybooks. The second fairy tale is the tale of Little Red Riding Hood. The better to run with, my child, and quote. And quote, grandmother dear, what big ears you have, and quote. And quote, the better to hear with, my child, and quote. And quote, "Grandmother dear, what big eyes you have," and quote. The story of Little Red Riding Hood. In the most popular modern version of the fairy tale, the wolf distracts her and goes to the grandmother's house, enters it, and eats her whole. Then, he disguises himself as the grandmother and waits for the girl, who is also attacked when she arrives. Next, the wolf falls asleep, but a lumberjack hero appears and makes an opening in the wolf's stomach with an axe. Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother come out unharmed and put stones in the wolf's body, so that when he awakens, he's unable to flee and dies. The origins of Little Red Riding Hood go back to the 10th century in France, where peasants told the story that was then passed along to the Italians, who were obviously enchanted by it. A few other versions with a similar title were created: La Finta Nonna, the False Grandmother, or The Story of Grandmother. Here, the character of an ogre replaces the wolf that imitates the grandmother. Little Red is deceived into mistaking her granny's teeth for rice, her flesh for steak, and her blood for wine, so she eats and drinks, and then jumps into bed with the beast and ends up getting gobbled up herself. Some versions include illicit implications and involve a scene where Little Red is asked by the wolf to take off her clothes and throw them in the fire. Some folklorists have tracked down records of other French folk versions of the story, in which Little Red realizes the wolf's attempted trickery, and so she invents an "I desperately gotta use the bathroom" story to her grandmother in order to escape. The wolf reluctantly approves, but ties her with a string to prevent her from fleeing, but she still succeeds in escaping. Interestingly, these versions of the story depict Little Red Riding Hood as a courageous heroine who relies only on her wit to avoid the horror, whereas the later official, published versions by Perrault and Grimm include an older, male figure who saves her. The French folklorists and writer Perrault's version of the story in the 17th century featured a young girl next door to a village, who incredulously shares her grandmother's address with a wolf. Next, the wolf exploits her naivety by asking her to get into the bed, where he then attacks and eats her. This not-so-happy ending was later explained by Perrault himself, in order to cast any doubts away regarding the moral of the story. According to him, the story should be a forewarning for young, pretty girls to avoid strangers. Further, he noted that he chose a wolf to be a villain because wolves resembled people. Some of them might not be noisy or hateful, but they deceive with their gentleness, enter the young girls' homes, and turn out to be fatal. 2 centuries later, the brothers Grimm rewrote Perrault's tale but also created their own variant, named Little Red Cap, in which an animal skin hunter saves the girl and her grandmother. The brothers wrote a volume of the story in which Little Red Riding Hood and her granny encounter, and do away with another wolf using a strategy supported by their previous experience. This time, Little Red ignored the wolf in the woods. Grandma didn't let him enter, but when the wolf skulked around, they lured him with the smell of sausages from the chimney under which they previously put a manger filled with water. The wolf plunged into it and drowned. In 1857, the brothers Grimm concluded the tale as we know it today, reducing the somber undertones of other versions. Their practice was continued by the writers and adapters of the 20th century who, in the wake of deconstruction, Freudian analysis, and feminist critical theory, produced rather refined versions of the popular children's fairy tale. The third fairy tale is the tale of the Little Mermaid. What's not to love about the Little Mermaid? But Andersen's "The Little Mermaid" is much darker, more gruesome, and heartbreakingly tragic compared to Disney's animated adaptation, a tone that holds true to the style of early fairy tales. Originally, the genre was often frightening, filled with monstrous villains, and absent the trademark Disney happy endings. Let's explore the dark history of The Little Mermaid, In the original The Little Mermaid, the eponymous protagonist doesn't even have a name. Neither do the sea witch Ursula in the film, or the prince. This is a common fairy tale convention, allowing the characters to better embody their archetypes and hint at the universality of their stories. In the case of The Little Mermaid, that's a story about seeking love and approval from a place that feels out of reach. However, it's also possible to read a darker meaning into the mermaid's lack of a name, a sign that she's less than a full and autonomous person. But this is not the only difference between the Disney version and the original Andersen tale. In Andersen's original story, the Little Mermaid's paternal grandmother teaches and guides her through life after her mother's death. The grandmother is described in the original text as a clever woman, an altogether praiseworthy person, particularly so because she was extremely fond of her granddaughters, the little sea princesses, and quote, "It's the grandmother who tells the princesses when they may visit the surface, explaining that when they turn 15, and quote, you will be allowed to rise up out of the ocean and sit on the rocks in the moonlight, to watch the great ships sailing by, and quote." There's also another difference. Ariel's sisters have a different role in the Disney version. In Disney's and quote, The Little Mermaid, and quote, Ariel's sisters are hardly characters, but they're more prominently featured in Andersen's fairy tale. In the original story, all 5 of the Little Mermaid's sisters are older than her, so they all get to visit the surface of the ocean before she does. The youngest mermaid princess is so curious about the surface and the world of humans that she asks her sisters about their visits, despite none of them being as interested in the humans as she is. There's another big difference with the deal she strikes with Ursula. As part of the Faustian bargain Ariel makes with Ursula in Disney's and quote, The Little Mermaid, and quote, the witch takes the mermaid's voice in exchange for giving her legs. In Andersen's original fairy tale, the sea witch says, and quote, you have the sweetest voice of anyone down here at the bottom of the sea, and while I don't doubt that you would like to captivate the prince with it, you must give this voice to me, and quote. Not only does the sea witch take the mermaid's voice, but she does so by brutally cutting out her tongue. Clearly, the Little Mermaid is seriously committed in this darker and more violent version of the story. In Disney's and quote, The Little Mermaid, and quote, Ariel trades her beautiful singing voice for legs so she can pursue Prince Eric's love while visiting his kingdom and exploring the human world. When Ariel asks how she's supposed to win his heart with no voice, Ursula tells Ariel that body language is important, a despicable reminder from the villain that a woman's looks are often seen as more valuable to some than what they have to say. In Andersen's version, this trade isn't such a sweet deal. The mermaid's tongue is cut out as payment for her legs, but even then the torment doesn't stop. In the original text, the sea witch says that the mermaid will be the most graceful woman in the human world, and quote, but every step you take will feel as if you were treading upon knife blades so sharp that blood must flow, and quote. Another difference is. In the Andersen story, the prince doesn't treat Ariel very well. The prince of Hans Christian Andersen's and quote, The Little Mermaid and quote, isn't such a great guy. He enjoys being entertained by dancing and quote, slave girls, and quote, and the Little Mermaid joins in the dancing too, hoping to win his affection. In Andersen's text, the prince calls her his and quote, dear little foundling and quote, and gives her a velvet pillow to sleep on outside his bedroom door. His treatment of her is inconsistent, and he sends a lot of mixed messages. In the original and quote, Little Mermaid, and quote, our stalwart protagonist doesn't win the prince's heart. He marries another woman, a princess who he believes was the one who saved him when she found him washed up on a beach after his shipwreck. Of course, the Little Mermaid knows it was really she who saved the prince, but there's nothing she can do. The prince is so callous and unobservant that he doesn't even notice how distraught the mermaid is. She accompanies the wedding party out to sea on a boat, feeling just awful that she's failed and understanding that by sunrise she'll turn to sea foam and soon be forgotten. For a part 2, please like or comment down below.
Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.